So that bone, that's your femur. This is called the greater trochanter. So the greater trochanter should line up vertically with the lateral malleolus, this outer ankle bone here. So this bone and this bone should line up vertically as it does on this skeleton. So it does that because it's basically just hanging. So it acts as, the weight of those bones acts as a plumb bob. But you want the same thing in your own body. When you're standing, the trochanter should line up vertically with the outer ankle bone. It's pretty easy to check that actually. If you just kind of put your finger on it, you mark it, and then you stand in front of a mirror, you can sort of tell. You have the buckle hanging, and then you put the belt right on the center of the trochanter. Center meaning from front to back. And then you drop that belt down, and that belt should hang in line with the outer ankle bone. And typically what you'll find, this is extremely common, that a lot of people, they do this and their belt is like hanging more like mid-foot, right? Because it's really common to have the hips pushed forward. It's more common than not, actually. So you gotta do what I call back the hips up. You gotta get your hips back. And when your hips go back, you're gonna feel like your pelvis is tipping a little bit more forward initially, which is not that you want that, but it's just that's because of the tension in the hips and because of the habit that you have of how you hold the body. So if you can then get the pelvis to upright, where the pelvis rotates back to the neutral position and you release that tension in the low back, then you're golden at that point. But if you lack flexibility in the front of your hip, it's very difficult to do that. You kind of need some help. How do I get that flexibility back? How do I get the ability to open up the front of the pelvis so that I can actually upright the pelvis so that I'm not doing the workaround, which is basically standing with the hips pushed forward. Which is to the lumbar spine. So if you see these bones sticking out here underneath the ribs, so these are the lateral spinous processes. So you have to kind of envision that you had parts of this band that were attaching to every single one of these, and actually even attach into the vertebral bodies themselves. So there's a lot of attachment points. But then all of those parts of the muscle merge together, they run down through the pelvis, and they insert down here on the lesser trochanter of the femur. So if this is the greater trochanter, the lesser trochanter is right here. So they all attach to this point. I should try to fold this. So, like so, all right? So the psoas is often thought of as a hip flexor because of where it attaches. It pulls the femur and the lumbar spine together, right? But because it attaches to so many places on the lumbar spine, it's more complicated than that. And really what it does mostly is it greatly influences our ability to stand upright, because if the muscle is too short, it's going to pull the hip into flexion, which will, in an upright posture, if that's the case, then when I drop my leg, when I straighten my knee, it's going to then pull my lumbar spine forward. It's like, let's say you're in a long car ride, so you're sitting for hours in one position, and so here's my psoas, right? And so I'm like this for a long time. So when I flex the hip, the psoas muscle will go into slack. But muscles don't do that in the body. They don't just like slacken and then stay in that slackened position. What they do is they adapt to it. So now the muscle has adapted to being kind of in this hip flex position. Then I go to stand up from the car, and I don't have enough length in the muscle anymore, and so either I have to stand with my knees bent, or if I straighten my knees, I'm going to end up arching my back, which feels terrible on my back. So I don't ever do this. It's rare that you see somebody do this, but typically what we do instead is then we push our hips forward to take away the pressure in the low back. All right, so that's a really common thing. So we need to be able to get the hips back, so I have that vertical alignment, but now I don't have my back in the right position anymore. And so if my psoas is too short, I need to address that somehow. That's really the point. Like so. And if you don't have a bolster, there's another way you can do this, but I would recommend getting a bolster if you don't have one. And then I'm going to put just my upper back on the bolster. So the edge of the bolster is going to hit me about the bottom edge of my shoulder blades, maybe slightly lower. And then I adjust the head height. My head should be high enough that when I put my head back, my ribs don't pop up. So if when I take my head back, my ribs come up and I'm arching my low back, then I need more height under my head. And then I'm going to stretch out my legs. Now this is the most important part of this pose. When I get to here, number one, it should not hurt my back. So if you do this and you find, wow, that really hurts my back, then don't do it, right? But assuming that number one, you can check that box. Number two, the pelvis should be neutral. So how do I know if the pelvis is neutral? The pelvis should be level, which means the ilium and the pubic bone are at the same height. So if I put a block on my ilium and my pubic bone, I can see that it's level, all right? That tells me that the bolster is sufficient height for me to do this pose properly. If I put my block on my pubic bone and my ilium and I saw that my pubic bone was lifted up and I could feel that the backs of my thighs didn't touch the floor, then I would know that I needed more height under my back. So this is recording, so you'll get this video, and so you can look back at this. You're going to want to catch all these details. But it's important that for this to be effective, that you have enough height under your back that when you're lying here and you're just relaxed, you're not doing anything, the pelvis sits level. Right? Once you get that, assuming that it's not hurting your back, then you just relax. And you just lie here. And if you find that after a minute or two, you start feeling it in your back, then it means that it's time to come out of the posture. So if you want to set that up, now if you don't have a bolster, then you could use like a sofa cushion as a bolster. But you could also take an extra block and you'd have the half dome as the substitute for the bolster, and then the block for your head. So in this case now I have my shoulder blades on the half dome and my head on the block. And if I want to add height to the head, which usually I actually do, I put a blanket on this block. Again, the half dome should hit me near the bottom edge of my shoulder blades. And then the pelvis should still be neutral, which it is. So this would work for me, but the half dome is not very high. So for someone who has a very short psoas, they may need more height than just the half dome. So that may not work for everyone. I have, worked with people where the psoas is so short that they need a bolster and even blankets on top of that to get their upper back high enough that they actually can lie with a neutral pelvis. And I can't emphasize that enough. It's not just the height, it's having enough height, because you're trying to get the body in a position where you can put the psoas into slack, so the psoas can start to relax. And then meanwhile, you've got that space underneath your low back, which is unsupported, and gravity pushing down. Now, you don't feel this. It's not something that's going to register necessarily with your senses, but what is happening is that little by little, the weight of your rib cage and the weight of your spine is dropping your spine and dropping the spinal attachments of your psoas down toward the floor. Meanwhile, as long as the pelvis is neutral, the attachment on the femur is anchored in place. So if you have one end of the muscle fixed and then the other end of the muscle moving away from that, then by definition the muscle is getting longer. It's not a feeling of stretch. It's not a sensation of, oh, I feel that happening. It's more, it just kind of happens. And so you have to kind of set it up right and trust in it. And then as long as you're not getting pain doing it, you can start gradually increasing your time and work, up to like 10 minutes a day in that position. That's my recommendation. If you find like, I could only do this for like a minute and then my back starts to hurt, then you do it for a minute, and you do it for a minute every day until you can do it for a minute and 10 seconds, and you work your way up that way. Just because the back bothers you doesn't mean that it's not indicated. It just may mean that you need to kind of coax your body more gradually into accepting the posture. So to come out of the position, you don't want to suddenly load the muscle by kind of yanking your trunk up. So you want to bend your knees, and then you roll yourself off the bolster onto your side, and then you'd sit up from there. The combination really of 3 months prone and psoas release on a bolster, those two postures will get you to that upright standing position. But you need both the stability and you also need the muscle length. And the psoas release on the bolster will help you to get that muscle length back. If the psoas is short, which it is on the majority of people, it's hard to get yourself upright. But that pose is incredibly effective, and over time you can completely restore the length of the muscle. And, as a yoga teacher, I use this pose a lot for teaching Shavasana, because what I started to see when I was teaching it is that students relax in the pose really, really fast. So it has this effect of really bringing down the tone of the sympathetic nervous system. So a lot of kind of stress response in the body tends to kind of, there's a relationship between the sympathetic response and the psoas tension. And you can kind of come at it from that direction of, if I relax the psoas, it also relaxes that tension in the nervous system at the same time. Okay, good, thank you.